In December 2008, a man named Steve Heimoff came home from dinner and found an email from his cousin. The subject line said two words: bad news. Steve opened it. His $2 million retirement fund, the money he had spent his entire working life building, the money that was supposed to carry him through the rest of his years, was gone. Not down, not reduced. Gone. He hadn't made a bad investment. He hadn't gambled. He hadn't ignored the warnings. He had trusted the wrong man. And so had a Nobel Peace Prize winner, and a Hollywood director, and thousands of hospitals, charities, and retirement funds across 40 countries. The man they all trusted was Bernie Madoff. And what he did to them was not complicated. It wasn't sophisticated. It wasn't even particularly clever. It worked because of something far more dangerous than intelligence. It worked because of trust. And once you understand exactly how he manufactured that trust, step by step, decade by decade, you will never look at a financial opportunity the same way again. Before Bernie Madoff was the largest financial fraudster in history, he was exactly the kind of person you would want managing your money. He started with $5,000 in savings at 22 years old and built one of the most respected securities firms on Wall Street. He helped create the technology that became the NASDAQ exchange. He served as its chairman. He sat on the boards of financial regulatory bodies. He was, by every visible measure, an architect of the modern financial system. His reputation was not manufactured overnight. It was built across 4 decades of genuine accomplishment, real relationships, and consistent performance in a world where most investors struggled to beat the market at all. And then he offered something that should have been impossible: consistent returns of around 10% annually, every year, in up markets and down markets, through recessions and booms, without a single significant losing year across nearly 2 decades. The S&P 500 over the same period had years of negative 30%, years of negative 40%. Madoff had none of that. He just kept delivering, quietly, consistently, year after year. That consistency, it turns out, was the first warning sign, and almost nobody saw it. Here is where the psychological mechanic that made Madoff's scheme not just possible, but inevitable. Most Ponzi schemes fail quickly. They offer returns of 20%, 30%, 50%, numbers so extreme that skepticism kicks in eventually, and the whole thing collapses within a few years. Madoff offered 10%. That number was just high enough to be attractive and just low enough to be believable. His investors weren't greedy. They weren't chasing 50% returns. They were conservative, sophisticated people who thought they were making a safe, boring choice. Doctors, retirees, charitable foundations, people who had already built wealth and simply wanted to preserve it. And Madoff told them exactly what they wanted to hear. "I'm not going to make you rich overnight. I'm just going to make sure you never lose." That promise, stability, safety, predictability, is one of the most powerful psychological levers in finance because the fear of loss is more motivating than the desire for gain. And Madoff wasn't selling greed, he was selling the absence of fear. His investors slept well at night. They recommended him to their friends recommended him to their friends. For 20 years, a community of trust grew around a man who was doing absolutely nothing with their money except moving it between accounts. Here is where it gets more uncomfortable. Because Madoff didn't just attract investors, he made them beg to get in. Access to Madoff's fund was not openly advertised. There was no website, no pitch deck, no cold calls. You had to know someone who knew him. You had to be referred, and even then you might be rejected. This was not accidental. Psychologists call it artificial scarcity, the deliberate limitation of access to create the perception of exceptional value. When something is hard to get, the human brain assumes it must be worth getting. The difficulty of access becomes evidence of quality. The waiting list was the product. Investors who were finally accepted didn't just feel fortunate, they felt validated, chosen. Their acceptance into Madoff's fund became a status symbol, something they mentioned quietly at dinners, a mark of financial sophistication that separated them from ordinary investors. And here is the brutal irony. That feeling of being chosen, that pride of access, became one of the reasons people didn't ask questions. Because asking questions felt like doubting the judgment that had granted them access in the first place. The exclusivity was the cage, and his investors had competed to get inside it. This is the part of the story that is almost impossible to believe. In 2000, a financial analyst named Harry Markopolos sat down with Madoff's performance numbers and figured out in 4 hours that the returns were mathematically impossible. 4 hours. He submitted a detailed report to the Securities and Exchange Commission titled, "The World's Largest Hedge Fund is a Fraud." The SEC investigated, and then closed the investigation, without finding anything. Markopolos submitted again in 2001, then again in 2005, then again in 2007. Each time the SEC reviewed, questioned, and walked away satisfied. In 2001, Barron's magazine published a piece publicly questioning how Madoff generated his returns. The article named him, the concerns were specific, the financial press read it, and moved on. In 2003, an SEC investigator began raising questions about unusual trading patterns at Madoff's firm. She was told to focus on something else. The warnings were not hidden. They were loud, documented, and repeatedly ignored by the most powerful financial regulatory body in the world. And Madoff, when he was later asked how he kept it going, said something chilling. "They never even looked at my stock records. It would have been easy to see." He wasn't afraid of getting caught. He was confused that it took so long. By September 2008, the global financial crisis had arrived. Markets were collapsing, investors everywhere needed liquidity, and for the first time in 2 decades, Madoff's fund was facing something it had never faced. Everyone wanted their money back at the same time. Between September and December 2008, investors pulled approximately $7 billion from the fund. Madoff scrambled to find new money, called in favors, tried every lever he had built over 40 years to keep the machine running. It wasn't enough. On December 9, 2008, he called his sons into his apartment and told them the truth. His investment fund was, in his own words, just one big lie. A giant Ponzi scheme. He had nothing left. His sons reported him to federal authorities the next morning. 2 days later, Bernie Madoff was arrested, and the losses totaled approximately $65 billion. Steve Heimoff stopped going to restaurants. He stopped buying clothes. He stopped going on vacations. At 58 years old, Michael DeVita had been preparing to retire, and instead went back to work for another 10 years. Elie Wiesel, a Holocaust survivor and Nobel Peace Laureate, lost his entire charitable foundation. And Madoff's son, Mark, who had turned his father in, who had denied any knowledge of the scheme, hanged himself in his Manhattan apartment exactly 2 years to the day after his father's arrest. The damage was not just financial. It reached into families, foundations, and lives in ways that $65 billion cannot fully measure. Here is the question you need to sit with. How did the smartest investors in the world, people with access to advisors, accountants, and lawyers, miss something that Harry Markopolos figured out in 4 hours? The answer is not stupidity. And it is not greed. It is a psychological phenomenon called social proof, the tendency to evaluate the safety of a decision based on how many trusted people around you have already made it. When your doctor, your brother-in-law, your colleague, and your rabbi all invest with the same man, when everyone you trust has trusted him first, your brain stops processing him as a risk. He becomes a consensus. And consensus, as we've seen before on this channel, is one of the most dangerous conditions in finance. Nobody asked hard questions because everyone around them had already decided the answers were fine. That is not a character flaw. That is evolution. The same social wiring that kept humans safe in tribes for thousands of years becomes a liability the moment a sophisticated operator learns to manufacture the appearance of consensus. And here is the part that should make you genuinely uncomfortable. Madoff didn't target stupid people. He targeted communities, tight-knit social networks where trust already existed and information traveled fast. Jewish community organizations, country clubs, charitable boards, places where people already knew each other, already trusted each other, and where a recommendation from a friend carried the weight of a guarantee. He didn't beat their intelligence. He bypassed it entirely. So here is the question worth carrying out of this video. When was the last time you evaluated a financial decision based on the actual numbers? And when was the last time you made one because someone you trusted already had? Those are not the same thing, and the gap between them is exactly where $65 billion disappeared. Madoff died in prison in April 2021 at 82 years old. His victims are still receiving partial repayments from a recovery fund that has clawed back approximately $14 billion, a fraction of what was lost, and nothing at all for what it cost the people who trusted him. The lesson is not trust nobody. That is not a life anyone can live. The lesson is simpler and harder than that. Trust is not a substitute for verification. The people around you making the same decision is not evidence that the decision is right. Popularity is not safety. Exclusivity is not quality. And consistency that defies market conditions is not skill. It is a warning. The financial system is full of people who are very good at making you feel safe. The work is in knowing the difference between feeling safe and being safe. Madoff's victims learned that difference. They just learned it too late.